Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I want to try and address experimental archaeology and history today because essentially experimental archaeology and history is about attempting and testing various ideas, explanation, hypotheses of known facts, so things we already have a foundation for, like archaeological findings or historical data, but we may not have the full picture. There are many things we don't know yet. And experimental archaeology and history can be a way into creating a fuller picture, and not only from a practical perspective, but also from a research and a data gathering perspective. And it's a really, really fun and interesting side of history and archaeology to dive into. So let's have a look at what it actually is. As always, if you like the content of these videos, please like them, subscribe to the channel, and also add your comments. I'm pretty sure you have lots of examples of experimental archaeology and history and have seen lots of it. So please share your thoughts. What worked, what didn't work, how did you find it? But what is actually the purpose of experimental archaeology and history? What's it actually for? What can it be used for? Well, first of all, I'm sure you have seen archaeological buildings or reconstructions of buildings before, where you literally try to attempt to build archaeological houses, for example, or huts as they were and as you know them from archaeological findings using the same material. The same can be done with transportation, for example, building ships or boats, wagons, etc. Craftsmanship, so trying to create and use original tools. First of all, try to make them, but how were they used then? How do you best use them? Weapons. It can also be things like musical instruments that may no longer exist, but that have developed into something that we know today. So just trying and testing different sounds, for example, of musical instrument can be quite a big part of this as well. Food and cooking, so for example, recreate historical recipes or using ingredients that we may no longer use. It can also be recreating ceremonies or events, everything from festivals or markets, weddings, whatever it is that we, for example, know from descriptions, historical descriptions. Now, a thing that's quite often used in experimental archaeology and history is a thing like style and fashion, because often this is something very tangible that we know from, for example, historical findings or archaeological findings and descriptions. So clothes, makeup, even hats, wigs, it can be shoes and boots, everything from the material to how they were made and how to wear them, what they were like to walk in. Now, this is something that can be used often in living history when you are recreating a specific historical period. So maybe you are walking around in copies of clothes as it looked. It can be doing things, activities like you did once, maybe cooking or creating things, maybe sewing and so on. It can also be used as part of visitor tours when you do dramatized tours or when you do learning and education. So for example, children participating in learning programs or adults on tours. Now, there's also quite a good use for experimental archaeology and history in research, even in chronological dating, because you are also gathering information and data as you do these experiments. You find out how things were used, how they were created, how difficult or easy they were, and indeed what kind of skills were needed to recreate and perhaps build these things. You also get a sense of how things develop. So why was it that this particular way of making glass, for example, came chronologically before this particular type of glass? Did it require something in the development that were more advanced, for example? Also, you get a really good idea about how to define materials and objects and methods for doing things. So sometimes you actually find out that the way something was made might turn out to be very different from what you had originally thought, because the tool used had to be used in a very specific way or in a very different way, or the material that you thought you could use for building a house or something turned out to not really work. Instead, you have to use a different material. Some of the benefits of experimental archaeology and history is not just recreating replicas of archaeological or historical restorations or experimentation or testing. It's also the fact that you are gaining and collecting new knowledge and new information. This can actually lead to involvement and experimentation with different expertise and skills. So maybe you're actually involving your local community. It can be something like you are going to your local hairdresser and asking them to do an ancient hairdo or historical wig or something like that. It can be really anything, and it can create a really good informative community and partnership involvement, but it can also lead to new ways of experimenting with already known skills and expertise. So there's a cross-sector involvement in this as well. Now, the learning and educational outcomes here can be vast. Not just from an educational perspective, something you can actually use in your educational program, but also when it comes to actually learning about the past, learning about how things were used, learning about the skills behind something. You can also use this in events development, in workshops, festivals, markets, and so on, and you can set up new events and involve more people and more audiences that way. There's also an element of preservation and conservation in this, because you literally get to know about materials. You literally get to know about, okay, for how long can this actually last? For how long can this hold? If we do a recreation of a historical house, for example, what is required to actually preserve this, to keep it going, to restore it? How much restoration is required? How much looking after and maintenance is required around this? One of the great things about doing experimental archaeology and history, I find, is that even though you might not reach the conclusions that you think when you start an experiment or a project, you will reach something, you will gain new knowledge. So even projects, recreations or experiments that may go wrong or may have a completely different outcome will still lead to some kind of knowledge and some kind of new information. There are so many really wonderful attempts of experimental archaeology and history. Just to mention one, the Kentucky expedition back in 47 with Thor Heyerdahl. That was an extreme one, but there are some really fantastic, wonderful things going on at many museum and historical and archaeological sites. And it's something that we can all more or less try out on a very small scale. Try building, try creating, trying using tools, or trying on historical clothes or copies of clothes, or trying to create it, trying to make it. So it's very tangible and it's very approachable in a way, and it's a very, very quick and interesting way of gaining new knowledge. What's your thoughts and your experiences around this? Please do share.